and inequality, foreign direct investment, development aid, and on youth in economic development. Last but not least is Eyo Balcha Gebremariam. He has a doctoral degree in development policy and management from the University of Manchester. He taught postgraduate courses in African political economy and African development at the London School of Economics for 4 years. Currently, he's a researcher at the Privoli Africa Research Center, University of Bristol, and a visiting fellow at the Institute for Humanities in Africa, HUMA, University of Cape Town. So these are our first set of panelists. And I would now like to call on first Charles and then Michael to make some opening remarks as representatives of the organizers.
Thank you, Professor Chikata, for the opening remarks. Let me express ideas, gratitude for the opportunity to collaborate, both in the GETSPA project generally and in organizing the events this week. Also take the opportunity to welcome all the participants, especially from outside Ghana. Georgie made the point that it was 25 years ago, those of us who were active in civil society were engaged in mobilizing public opinion for debt relief. It was crystallized around the Jubilee debt campaign. Jubilee is an ancient mechanism. In fact, it is an ancient Greek mechanism that became subsumed by as a biblical mechanism, which says that every Jubilee year, those in bondage must be relieved of their bondage. And that's whether that bondage is slavery, the bondage is the mortgage of your land to a landlord, or the bondage is debt. And that slates are cleaned so that society starts afresh. And this is the concept that every 25 years, especially biblical entities, to promote conversations about debt write-offs. 25 years ago, when the Jubilee campaign took off, and as a result of it, countries in Africa in particular that were predominantly low-income countries benefited most. So you would see that that debt relief led to a very low level of debt distress and debt overhang. Barely 10 years later, the debt buildup started to rise again, and today we are back 25 years later into debt distress. But the nature of the debt distress today is completely different from that debt distress of 25 years ago. Not only is it that the atmosphere of empathy has shifted dramatically, but the structure of the debt has shifted dramatically. Debts that are subject to radical restructuring are debt owed largely to private investors, not even banks, but equity investors who buy bonds that are sold by governments seeking foreign exchange. And they do so for one reason and one reason only: to take advantage of the fact that yields in these bonds are far higher. Yields are the interest rates that are applied to bond markets, same as interest is applied to commercial loans. So the yields are highest in countries who are capital deficient. And Africa, in particular, is a victim of this. Now, 25 years ago, you could engage with governments. Today, you have a faceless set of bondholders, led by a few big ones. Nevertheless, there is political space for for engagement in restructuring these debts. There are three things that need to be addressed, and I will stop. One is that there is no effective framework other than the framework that was put together by G20, called the Common Framework for Addressing Private Debt. Ghana has so far been the only country that has benefited somewhat from a debt restructuring regime that has led to head cuts at least around 30%. Nevertheless, it has not addressed the cumulative impacts of the debt. There is no international mechanism for working out private debts. Secondly, bond-led debts go into the budget, unlike projects loans that go directly into projects. And so that means it requires that for bond debts to be effective in development, that there is a good governance, there's an effective oversight by civil society, and that the money is channeled effectively to both social development and economic development. The fact that we are in a situation where debt restructuring is leading to more poverty and with a negative impact on both the economy and in the social sector means that the governance mechanism has not worked effectively. And I think part of the research that and the work that we are doing, that GETSPA is doing, hope it will contribute to our understanding as to how this new structure of debt is impacting the social sector and what could be done to ensure that debt restructuring balances between the interests of creditors and the interests of our societies. So you are welcome to this forum.
Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you very much, Professor Chikata. So anytime I hear of debt, I remember one of our former heads of states, Kutua Chiampon, Yentua, which simply means we won't pay, right? I think Africa's debt burden is something of great concern to all of us, and I must say on the behalf of GETSPA that we appreciate the interest of those of you here in the hall, and of course those also online, in discussion around debt, austerity, and social policy. But why social policy? More often than not, social issues tend to become the victims of economic decisions around debt. And when we do that, we tend to forget that when we squeeze social policy or social spending in the interest of servicing debt, we impose hardship, costs, suffering, poverty on lives and livelihood. What that does is that it reminds us that behind every economic decision are human faces. And it is important to always keep that in mind. Will those human faces be smiling, Will they be frowning or will they be suffering? In a sense, there is the need to have a fair balance between economic decisions and their implications for social policy. Over the years, especially since the 1980s, there seems to have been a false narrative that created dichotomy between the social and the economic. But the more you do work on social policy, the more you realize that you need the social to reinforce the economic, and the more you need the economic to reinforce the social as well. And it is my hope that in this and many other gatherings, particularly spearheaded by Ideas and GETSPA, we will be able to highlight the synergy, the interface, and the symbiotic relationship between the social realm and the economic realm, because it is only when we are able to find a fair balance that we will be close to a solution that allows some breathing space as far as financial resources are concerned for African countries to breathe and spend on education, spend on healthcare, spend on job creation, and spend on growth in general. So I want to join both Charles and Georgie and our colleagues in GETSPA and, of course, Ideas to once again welcome all of you and to say that we really appreciate this interest. We want this to grow into a much bigger network. The conversation must continue beyond what has been going on this week. And we must expand the frontiers of the conversation so as to make sure that policymakers, civil society activists, and the ordinary folks understand that these conversations are very important for their livelihood. Thank you very much, and let's have a fruitful conversation.
Thank you. Will the slide be projected? Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Iyob, as Georgie told me. I will be presenting briefly the findings and arguments of the research that I did for this particular work. The most central argument or the most central message that I want to put across in this particular issue is how, not this one, the one that says Ethiopia. So, yes, yeah, please go to the next slide. I said in the workshop, I have a favorite slide. Oh, I can use this. Okay. Yes, this is my favorite slide. This is a quote from a book chapter that the late Ethiopian Prime Minister wrote. And he argues that development is a political process first and an economic and social process after. We can debate how he makes this distinction. It is the creation of a political setup that is conducive to accelerated development that sets the ball of development rolling, or transformative development we can add. So for me, the most important element is what kind of political setup do we need to ensure that our policies are transformative, to ensure that economic policies do not topple social policies, do not sacrifice social policies? What kind of political setup do we need to make sure that we pursue a fruitful life as a community? Oops, I think I went a little. Yes. So, in my work, what I focused on is to trying to understand what are the key elements of change and continuity within the Ethiopian context by looking at two consecutive governments the one that I characterize like a developmentalist state, which was a developmentalist government, which was designed by the late Prime Minister, and a new government that's currently in power, which came to power after an internal political rift within the ruling elite in 2018. And I argue that there was a strong attempt, and I would say partial success for the sake of because of the structural bottlenecks that really trapped the possibility of transforming the economy, of implementing transformative social policy in Ethiopia. But since 2018, we are going on the opposite direction, where neoliberal policy ideas and perspective become more dominant, and the policy making space has already been somehow extremely dominated by the discourse, not only at idea level, even individuals that used to work for the World Bank and the IMF. And I tried to have kind of a specific focus on gender inequalities and how it has somehow, how the problems were not adequately addressed during the developmental period, but somehow even more exacerbated at the moment. Broadly speaking, I think we can have this a bit simplistic but very useful categorization of social policies. Those operate within the minimalist context and also transformative social policy. But this distinction would allow us to identify at least two issues. One, it will allow us to identify what are the orientations, what are the central pillars and perspectives that drive the social policy framework. Then, what kinds of state-society relation do we see within that context? In the minimalist one, it's more of considering social policy as a corrective measure, somehow even like an afterthought after setting up the economic policies, where the targeting become and being means-tested efficiency, making that false dichotomy between equity and efficiency, growth and equity, something that's a bit very problematic for that matter. And I think Tandika identified a very interesting contradiction with this narrative, because these kinds of policy frameworks tend to advocate for a very small state with limited role to shape society. But in order to have effective targeting, you definitely need to have the capacity to register everyone within your jurisdiction and reach them and understand their content, their social life, so that you address their issues effectively. So targeting requires more capacity, which is more contradictory to the central tenet of this perspective. And on the transformative element, of course, Michael was talking about it, and the dichotomy is very deceiving. Every social policy is an economic policy, every economic policy is social policy. Of course, for analytical purpose, we may make the distinction, but in real life, we don't really see the difference. And understanding that intertwined relationship is very essential. And here I want to also emphasize the work that Jimmy Adesina emphasized, identifying the different roles that social policy has. And one important element here is the role it plays in nation building. Most of our post-independence governments have social policy frameworks that contributed to the nation building after independence. So what I have here is how the APRDF government that pursued building a developmental state as a developmental objective by planning the economic processes in a much more rational way, not for ideological satisfaction, pursued various socio-economic policies in issues of food security, agriculture, industrial policy, job creation, housing, and creating those intertwined relations. For instance, when the massive urban housing social policy, creating that infrastructure tied up with the job creation opportunity for young people, and also the industrial development strategy linked with the urban redevelopment process. So that deliberate planning helped the country to achieve a substantive economic growth. And it's good that you can see. If you see this table, it shows that at least on average, between the year 2008 and 2016, on average, the country's national budgets was invested on issues of water, agriculture, roads, education, and health, and on average around like 67, 68% of the national budget went to these so-called poor sectors. By doing so, substantive, not only just nominal economic growth, but the Human Development Index really improved significantly. Then comes, of course, as I said, the 2018 change within the ruling elite. But I want to emphasize that the political setup that the ruling party by that time established, even though it helped to pursue that kind of development, it also created, it has also its own inherent contradiction from within. Because developmentalism requires certain element of re-centralization of power, of decision making. But the historical process of state making in Ethiopia, what we have is a federal government, so regions, which where political engagement is very much along ethnic lines. So that's political decentralization, constitutional decentralization, has to be somehow reversed for the sake of pursuing this developmentalist narrative and policy processes. So that inherent contradiction, so that was one of the political setup. It helped to some extent. It helped to some extent, but it also became one of the causes of what I would call probably the abandonment of the developmental narrative. And of course, most of the winners of that political struggle were more interested in the neoliberal agenda. Then we just become more of like the new darlings of the IMF and the World Bank. The IMF and the World Bank never provided anything substantive in all those periods of developmentalism. It was, of course, there was a huge loan, including from private, the Eurobond. I think probably that's the one that kind of ballooned Ethiopia's debt crisis, and also a huge internal borrowing. But we've also passed through multiple shocks, COVID, civil war, which was also one of the consequence of the internal power rift, and also global challenge that we all are facing. Then now we have a government that simply copy-pastes, I would say, simply copy-paste all the policy narrative that comes from IMF and World Bank. Yes, there is some kind of claim from the government saying that they have managed to reduce the debt to GDP ratio, and similarly the external debt to GDP ratio, but this all comes at a cost. Imagine passing through civil war in the northern part and protracted conflict in different parts of the country, and the COVID pandemic. So now we are somehow, all the gains that were achieved during the developmental period are now being reversed. The economy is not growing in its direction, the way that's expected to happen, and also lots of multiple crises have created more problem, both structural or at substantive level. More importantly, I will finish up here. It's also the most concerning one is the loss of policy sovereignty. Now, the citizens are not the one who are making the decisions. Of course, I'm not saying I'm not saying that before that citizens had significant role in the saying, but it's primarily the interests of the World Bank and the IMF officials that have a precedent in shaping the social policy space in Ethiopia. So in order to redress this, in order to challenge such kinds of policy orientation practices, unless we go beyond those technocratic process where policies identify, social policies designed just through, identifying problem and coming up with a solution and implementing the political elements, centering politics, centering the distribution, ownership, and control of resources, and ensuring that the majority of the society is benefiting from that processes is, for me, the most important element, and that's what I try to emphasize in my research. I thank you.
Oh, they are showing Ghana. It's an image.
The other one.
Oh, I did.
The
Yeah.
other one.
And I now relate you. Okay. Don't worry.
Yes, thank you. Right. So for Malawi, I will basically be presenting a case of the situation of the debt crisis and how it affects social policy through one of the social policy mechanisms, which is the Farm Input Subsidy Program. So the main question that we are asking, oh no, I think it's a long presentation. Okay. Okay. Sorry. We had changed the presentation to suit the situation, so I think we're still beaming what we presented earlier. Okay. Can you put up the starting page, please? I'm not able to. I don't know whether it's helping this one. Yes. So which one is forward? Which one is backward here? Was that? I don't know. Please. Ah, yeah. So the main question that we were asking is through this research was to say, how does the debt crisis impact on input subsidy programs and with what implications for social policy? Specifically, we're looking at what are the debt crisis levels in Malawi. Over the years, we're looking at a historical period from 2005 to 2020, 2020. And then we're also looking at what are the implications. So basically, we're categorizing the implications in terms of the production implications, the gendered implications, but also the social reproduction implications. Now, to give you a context of Malawi, Malawi is predominantly an agrarian-based country where majority, over 80%, live in the rural areas, basically surviving on agriculture. And agriculture contributes about a third to the national GDP, employing over 60%, of whom 56% are women. And of course, the agricultural sector is where most of our foreign currency is earned. So that's why there are priorities to say subsidies or even policies should be prioritized through agriculture. One of the policies is the input subsidies that are being provided. So this graph basically shows the evolution of subsidies starting from just after independence in the 1960s, going all the way to 20. The name has changed, but basically the idea behind is the same. And maybe the other changes have been how they've been packaged, because through the period there have been different political regimes which have actually made the changes to be so. So the debt situation in Malawi, we see that there's high debt GDP ratio. As of 2024, it's around 86%, which is way high compared to the threshold, which is set at 60% for debt sustainability. And the country faces challenges in servicing the debt, because most of the times it is also through the loans that they service the debt. So there are defaults happening, and most of the times the country is left in vulnerability state, and there are several physical challenges that are faced. The high debt burden has also led to calls for debt relief. For example, of the total debt that the country owes, $4 billion is owed to the external creditors, and most of whom are these multilateral creditors like World Bank and IMF. Again, the external debt is largely owed in foreign currency, making it vulnerable to the exchange rate fluctuations. Apart from foreign debt, there's also a significant portion of the domestic debt, which is also held by the central government. So all this situation puts the country at a very difficult position in terms of balancing, dealing with the debt, but also making sure that social policy mechanisms are also in place. So this was a study, we did a lot of things, but I'll just take you straight to what we found. So in terms of the findings, they are categorized in 3 levels. The debt levels, we'll talk about the conundrum itself, which is the implication of debt on farm input subsidy program. And then we'll also zero in to talk about the implications for social reproduction, gender outcomes, but also production and social reproduction. So in terms of the debt levels, not sure if you're able to see, but the table shows the debt from 2002 to 2023 in million dollars, and then the debt to GDP percentage, but also per capita debt. As you can see, it has been increasing throughout, and as of 2025, in Malawian kwacha it's 15 trillion, but it's about $8.75 billion in debt. And like I indicated earlier, to GDP is about 86%. And almost 2/3 of the Malawi's debt is owed to multilateral development banks that I indicated. And these are, not sure if you're able to see, but I'm also indicating here the external creditors that we owe. And as you can see, in the first, you're looking at the amount of debt, which is the largest, which is owed to World Bank through the International Development Association, and all the other creditors, as you can see. Again, this shows the domestic creditors, mostly are the Central Bank and Reserve Bank, and the amount that is owed to these particular creditors. Here, I just want to focus on some of the macroeconomic indicators that are making even the situation precarious. So, for example, if you look at the inflation rate has been increasing. Of course, 2023 was at 27%, but like as of this year, it's about 32%. So it's increasing. And the exchange rate is also very unstable. As you can see, it has been increasing for a dollar to Malawi kwacha. And this was 2023. As I'm speaking, for the current one, the official rate is around 1,751. But on the black market, where most of the transactions happen, the rate is about 3,500. And so the precarity here comes in because all the businesses operate because we don't have, well, we've also reduced the foreign currency reserves. So most of the transactions in terms of importing things, they import things on black market rate because we don't have foreign currency available. So it means the prices on the market are sold based on the black market rate, not basically what the bank rate is. So that's the current situation. So we see here that when we look at how debt is derived from national budget, yes, so the national budget for this year, which the minister presented, was about 8 trillion Malawi kwacha, which some quarters have dubbed it very ambitious because we know that there are going to be budget deficits. We don't have that much to be able to cater for the whole the budget. And for that one, 27% of it is for servicing the debt. And so whatever sources it can come from, about 27% it has to service the debt. And you can also pay attention to the budget deficit itself. So we have a deficit of 9.7, 9.5 out of that 8 trillion. But also we look at how input subsidy programs. So if you see 131 billion, which is 1.6% of the national budget, we may look at it as a lot. Or if you look at the graph, it has been increasing. But it's because of the inflation rate that makes this money very, very small to be able to cater for that input subsidy program. So these are just, it's all on the news, how the situation is unfolding. So you look at how people are talking about the budget not being able, it's not clear within the budget statement where the money is going to be derived from. So the budget is presented, but it's not clear. And then the deficits that are there. And just last week, the deal that IMF had with the country on extended credit facility collapsed. So the promise was about $174 million, but during the time, they have only disbursed about $34 million, and the deal has collapsed. So because they were giving several conditions, and some of the conditions were in contradiction with the politics that we have, because we are having elections in September. Some of the conditions that were given, like, okay, you need to don't do any wage increases, or you should rethink the farm input subsidy program. The government knows that that's where the public is actually benefiting from. So if they impose these conditions on the people, they may not vote for them. So actually, it's a very difficult situation. And so the IMF said, okay, we're holding on until maybe the elections have passed. Then we'll see whether we can review that particular situation. And then, of course, just talking about not only the agriculture sector that is affected, there are so many sectors, including the health sector. And here you can see where we're saying the minimum wage was actually reviewed just last week to say, okay, it has to increase. But several quarters are saying even the increase is not enough because of the high inflation levels that are on the market. So all the sectors are actually facing the challenges. So in terms of FISIP, some of what you can note here is that, of course, we are showing the graph in terms of the number of beneficiaries and then the budget to it. So what I've indicated already is to say the budget can be increasing over the years, basically to cater for increases in the prices of fertilizer and all that. But if you look at the beneficiaries, they were increasing, but the access to it is not actually increasing. So the budget to FISIP has fluctuated in response to the national deficit as well. Again, I think in the discussion we've been talking about what is promised versus what is disbursed, again, versus what is utilized. There are so many disparities in there. And for the FISIP itself, even the number of beneficiaries if they can be like 1.5 million, but for people to access the fertilizer, you will see that the number is reducing. Again, to utilize the fertilizer, there is again reduction in who utilizes the fertilizer itself. So the communities are affected, and the number of beneficiaries over the years has been reducing, like I've indicated. So this just also shows how people talk about, for example, the first one is showing us that the maize yield is likely to be in deficit, because we're already foreseeing the impacts of how people are not being able to access fertilizer. If they have accessed, there are so many other challenges, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then there's an issue about how the maize, this is the maize now for on the market, actually the actual maize where people can buy and make food. The prices are actually increasing. And the FISIP itself, or input subsidies themselves, they have been seen by the general public, but I think this is not working. There are so many problems that are affecting the input subsidy program. Again, you see the evolution. So here I want you to pay attention to two things. Of course, over the years, you can see the number of beneficiaries have been increasing at some point, then reduction as well. The reduction has come in because of the different political regimes changing the tune to how it has to be implemented. But also you focus on how the package has changed. They included several legume seeds and cereals, but later they just focused on maize, because they're trying to reduce the cost. But this doesn't work so well for so many agroecological differences that we have. But also the other thing you need to pay attention to is the issue of the price which a farmer has to pay for them to access the fertilizer. It has been increasing over the years. And compared to when it was free, then later on they started adding something little. And for the different households, this is also very difficult for them. Okay, so production impacts, you see that, yes, if you look at the studies, they have shown that FISIP contributes to the yield increases and food security has improved. Studies have shown that. We've also talked to the committees that have confirmed that. Some don't want it to end, but it's the whole process of how it is done that is problematic. For example, there's poor utilization of FISIP. Like I said, the number of beneficiaries that the politicians flaunt on the news is not the same as those that access the fertilizer. Again, there are issues of local politics. So before, people could access 2 bags of fertilizer, which they will apply. But locally, the 2 bags of fertilizer, they have to be distributed among several households. Otherwise, the next season, they want to be on the list. So those are local politics that the chiefs have to manage within their communities, which also affects production. It means from that land, they will not be able to utilize efficient. Logistical challenges, not being able to access. Again, there's an issue of selling this fertilizer. So the fertilizer arrives, but that's the only thing of value somebody sees in the house. They don't have food. So they will be saying, let's sell the fertilizer. And then there are other social reproduction implications. You look at how high poverty levels are leading to not fully utilizing the FISIP program. There's also rural-urban migration, where the youth, they can't access the fertilizer in the rural areas. Farming is practically impossible without the fertilizer, so they migrate to town. And then those with land, if they can't do farming, they'll end up selling their land, and then they'll be selling their labor for survival. Yeah, these are, and then of course, gender implications, mainly not being able to, okay.
Otherwise.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's have that. Please, can you speak to your daughter?
Good evening. Well, I'm presenting a work together with my colleague Kofi Tichi Asante. And well, fortunately or unfortunately, compared to the previous presentations, ours seem to have a more bigger picture than the granular presentation from Malawi and from Ethiopia. So just to give you a bit of context, that we don't have case studies, but we are able to draw some lessons from Ghana's experience. So this broadly reflects our presentation, and that's the outlook in terms of what I'll be talking about. Because of time, I will be a bit brief on others and then spend more time on some other bits. So this broadly presents the picture which we are all familiar with, that the debt crisis is not new, but the more recent one, as have already been stated, is a bit more different. And this is the Ghana case. What we see is that the peaks have been rising, and it's something that we'll come to in the course of the discussion, particularly the cyclical nature of debt. And this is only to highlight a couple of things, particularly in the case of recent events on the international capital markets, where countries in Africa have become exposed to the appetite of borrowing from Eurobonds. And what we circle there is relative to most of the countries, Ghana and Nigeria seem to have accumulated quite a lot. And as the case of Ghana is, we certainly stand out as having defaulted, which certainly wasn't part of our long economic history. But there are a few issues that crop up with regard to the recent debt crisis, which is essentially why did we find ourselves in this situation when it appears history should have guided us sufficiently. So there is a bit about mismanagement and corruption, which we would say are more immediate, particularly in respect of how resources are utilized and what they are used for, particularly in relation to productive capacity, which literally is supposed to help economies pay back and then grow. And then there is the unrestrained borrowing in the capital market, which in the case of Ghana seemed to have had an incentive, particularly with the previous government's appetite to borrow and alleged benefits that the Minister of Finance then had. But that certainly represents a more immediate case. But as we'll see in the discussion, things are not necessarily so new. So this is just to give a bit of a background in relation to the wider picture, not just of Africa, but also of the general global south, and also of the world, because world debt, broadly speaking, has increased over time, although the focus on Africa is especially because of the development challenges that most African countries face. All right, so this then takes us to the roots of the crisis. And as I said in the beginning, our paper is a slightly, if like, liberal, freehand approach to the issue of the debt crisis and transformative social policies. So we kind of had liberty to do a bit more of investigation into aspects which were not in the Malawi case or the Ethiopia case. But what we basically point out here is to think through the root causes of the debt crisis, which essentially, given the quote from Thomas Sankara, the late, and the UN Secretary General, broadly point to a historical colonial origins of the nature of the continent to debt, which basically point to a relationship in which the continent was in debt before it even gained independence. And the economic structure which had been put in place broadly locked it to world capital, world markets, in such a manner as to render it broadly able to go into debt every now and again when there are some challenges which it faces. Then there are also the bits about the international financial capital system, which most countries, after gaining independence, found themselves automatically locked into. Now, bear in mind, these institutions were established before many of the countries on the continent gained independence. So they literally rolled themselves in. They had no hand in the rules of the game. So basically, they are subject to these sorts of international organizations. And as we shall be seeing later on, it raises certain questions as to how to get ourselves out of this cycle. So there are a few things to think about when we mention the transformative social policy, broadly anchored within the writings of Nkandawari and Adesina and co., which essentially is how social spending by governments enable transformation in a manner that brings about proper development. And I'm only trying to summarize it in a general sense, or what we might basically aim to achieve in terms of economic development as goals, objectives for many of the countries. Now, for these to be achieved, and this is where the issue of the debt crisis raises concern, we think, one, it has to be broad-based. It also requires what we term democratic citizenship, which is not simply going to vote or having an opportunity to speak every now and again, but that there is active participation, engagement, and consultation of citizens in the process which results in their own transformation. Now, to also achieve TSP, long-term planning becomes critical, which is again in contrast to international financial institutions' more short-term, medium-term focus. And that certainly constrains governments in respect of what they can do if you then place it within the bigger anchor of international financial subordination. But there's also the bit about policy autonomy and control of resources, which, as we probably would all attest to, is something that many countries, especially Ghana, find itself in a very tricky situation. So there are resources which we claim we own, but unfortunately we don't have a lot of sovereignty over them. And then there are also issues about policy, which inevitably seem to be, rolled over from the West. So as many of you may probably be aware, this is the 17th time Ghana has had to go to the IMF for reasons which have to do with the cyclical nature of the crisis that the economy literally finds itself embedded in. If there is a shock, the economy goes down, we need to get for some help. And that certainly means that we go to the helper which seems more willing to provide assistance, in this case the IMF. Okay, so there are bits of the program that we would only highlight for the presentation. First and foremost, the emphasis on the protection of social spending. Now, this was quite essential broadly in the narrative of the deal, but also in trying to sell it as something which is good. Okay. And the areas that we basically look at are social protection, which broadly involve the LEAP and some other, as well as education, here capitation grant, and then the National Health Insurance Levy. Now, there are a few things that need to be put in context. In terms of the LEAP, which is a cash transfer program, the amounts of money that are given is not something that you can say is transformative by any definition. But certainly, like one of my Chinese friends who say, 1 is bigger than 0. So if you have 10 relative to 0, you probably take it like that. Nevertheless, it still does not present an opportunity to get out of poverty. And some of the grants that are given for school feeding and capitation, for those who are not Ghanaian, I don't know how to put it in US dollar terms, but they are pretty much in cents per student, right? So if you think of the school feeding and some of the capitation grants, it's something less than 2 cedis per student. Now 2 cedis, well, using the current exchange rate, may be about 10 cents, right? So you can imagine what 10 cents can do. Then the National Health Insurance too has had a few challenges. And I'm only providing this just to put the whole deal in context, that there's been delays in payments, arrears. So quoting assurances in a deal does not necessarily resolve some of the social spending issues. Now this brings the whole story of the debt and then social spending in better context. So on the top row, we have data from the government appropriation bill, which is how much money is allocated. And there's been a talk about allocation, spending, timing, and the like. We'll come to that. So that's the Social Security, National Health Insurance Fund, and the Ghana Education Trust Fund. Now, these, as you can see, are less in broad than 1% of GDP. In fact, if you put all of them together, you are looking at something which is less than, or just about 2% of GDP, right? Now, that certainly, relative to the task of achieving transformative social policy, is very small. Now, in terms of the sectors which fall broadly under social protection or can be categorized as enabling social policy or transformative social policy, the picture is no different. Now, this is also going to be shocking. So when we then take the interest payments on debt as a percentage of GDP, it is quite evident that on average, this is quite large relative to how much is spent on the social sector and relative to how much is spent on social spending. Where's social spending? We define as Social Security, National Health Insurance, and then the Ghana Education Trust Fund. Okay. So this basically points to the difficult situation of transformative social policy within this current debt crisis. And the question that basically comes up is, how do we then make progress? Of course, I've talked about the leap, but this quote is only to put another part of the story in context, that usually the IMF will provide some praise to say, well, the program has been effective, but as you have seen, the amounts that are allocated are not that significant. And I think somewhere in 2024, there was also a report about Ghana having turned the corner, or about turning the corner, which certainly flies in the face of the reality of many Ghanaians in respect of how they are recovering from the debt situation. So this is where a bit more talk would come in terms of the way forward. Now, having talked about what transformative social policy involves, in the current context of the debt crisis, the first question is, how then do we gain control or greater control over resources? Because it is out of these resources that the possibility of expanding social spending and achieving transformation is important. And then there's also the bit about the long-term development planning. And well, I'm happy to know that recently the board has been commissioned or inaugurated, is that the right term? And we would hope that the culture of long-term planning will become quite embedded in policy making. But certainly this faces challenges in the sense of what we might call policy autonomy and the challenge of deep democratization. And here it's important to emphasize that we are not really thinking about the democracy where people can go and vote freely without violence or anything, but then the essence of ownership control by the public or by the citizens. And that is what would give governments that emerge from this process greater power to leverage on the will of the people in an attempt to achieve transformative social policy. Now, obviously, within the current context, there are always tensions that we have to think about. First, with limited resources, where does the money go? And there's always that tension between trying to invest in what are described as productive areas, as well as issues concerned with austerity. Now, if you have to service your debt, or if you default on your debt and you have to renegotiate or restructure your debt, and that raises a lot of concern. Usually, there is the bit about sweetness that are provided. Now, sweetness are simply to say, okay, we are going to spend a bit more money, probably giving school kids maybe free uniforms. I'm only using that as an illustration, which gives, a certain sense that things are going to be done well. And then we do a bit more cut on areas which are also very critical. Okay. But then there's also bits which are related to the choices that are available in a democracy, as we probably are practicing, as well as the conditionalities which are imposed Now, in terms of policy issues, which will come very soon, I will talk about them. So for TSP to be effective, there's also the bit about the developmental state, where the state acts as we might describe it as an entrepreneur. In other words, it does a lot of the heavy lifting to enable other actors within the bigger architecture of development to facilitate and enable the whole development. But usually with debt, the state is advised by the institutions that are literally advising them to cut down on their size. But it also requires, if we have to think of how to overcome the challenge, a bit of new thinking, particularly those that could be described as radical. And of course, it is no surprise that we now find, well, whether it's a craze or a new liking of the head of state of Burkina Faso, because he appears to be doing a lot more in sync with what the young growing population of Africa and some older generations from the post-independence era felt Africa could do. But there are risks involved, bearing in mind the nature and dynamics of our politics. Now, these two examples of Mandela and the big pharmaceutical companies and how he managed ultimately to obtain licenses or enable the production of ARVs to address the HIV pandemic in South Africa is important. And then there is also the case of Malaysia, where there was a raid on a strategic asset which had been controlled by the British. Of course, it was a tactical raid to take ownership. Now, the key point here is about gaining control of resources in the country. 1 minute. So there are a few policy issues that emerge. First, some of which have been highlighted in the two presentations, allocations for social policy transformation. There could be budgetary allocation, but the actual spending may not be so. Now, the bit about timing is obvious. Now, there's also the bit about the incentives that shape policymakers. Now, what sorts of incentives drive their policy making? Are these incentives local or foreign? Are they contextualized within the politics of democracy, where the nature of our democracy, at least in Ghana, is almost mimicking the American one, which basically implies those who fund tie the hands of policymakers in a way that limits their ability to act freely. And then there is also the bit about addressing corruption, which I'm sure would come to. And then the final bit is about this favorite thing about homegrown policies. Now, whether they are homegrown or they are foreign seeds grown on home soil is something that basically we need to talk about. But I'm sure my time is up, so I'll end that. Thank you very much.
There are threads that run through all their three presentations. The first one is about the fact that development is a political process rather than an economic or social. Throughout the three presentations, we heard a lot about the politics of development rather than its the technical ideas of development that have led us. We also learned that certain kinds of investments that we do not see as social policy are actually social policy. So we learned about the agricultural input subsidies as an important social policy instrument, particularly in agrarian countries. And the lesson being that we have to protect them and ensure that they actually work because this discussion about what's on paper and what actually works is a very important one, especially in our countries where the majority of the workforce are in the agricultural sector. This is not a trivial issue. And the third thing we learned was the importance of long-term planning and policy autonomy and space and so on. Again, many political issues, but also to pay attention to the structural character of debt and its origins in our colonial experience, and therefore to fashion the kinds of responses that actually address debt. With these few words, I want us to pivot into the second part of our event. And to assure you that there will be time for questions, we'll beg you for a bit more time so that we can actually have a bit of a discussion after we've heard from our discussants. Now my technology wants to fail me. Okay, so I will give up on this. Let me take my book. All right. So I just wanted to introduce three discussants before they come to the and actually, why don't you come? May I invite our three discussants? Dr. Nimoy Thompson, Dr. Pascal Xavier Kaba, and the representative of the Minister for Gender. Do we have the representative of the Minister of Oh, she's online. Oh, all right. So I'd like to introduce these discussants briefly. I'd like to introduce our discussants briefly before I call upon them to make their 10-minute responses each. Dr. Nimoy Thompson is the chairman of the National Development Planning Commission of Ghana, the NDPC, and also a senior advisor to the president of Ghana. He has nearly 30 years of experience as an economist in Ghana and abroad. And in Ghana, this is the second time he's serving as a senior economic advisor to the president of Ghana, President John Mahama. And he, in that period, in the first time he was advisor, he was also the Director General of the NDPC and led the preparations of Ghana's 40-year National Development Plan, which included a proposal for a 24-hour economy. I have a personal connection here. I served on the commission when Dr. Nimoy Thompson was the Director General. This was a very exciting and dynamic period in Ghana's planning history. It's interesting that the Ghanaians here talked about our long-term planning. The second speaker is Dr. Pascal Ajongba Xavier Kaba. He's a management, labor, and safeguarding expert and one of the Deputy General Secretaries of the General and Agricultural Workers Union, GAAS, of TUC. He's also the National Project Coordinator in charge of several projects of the union, and he has over 18 years of trade union work experience and more than 12 years in management positions. He has also done extensive work in the areas of decent work, savings, loan schemes, labor relations, advocacy, and cross-cutting themes that include productivity and work ethics, management, financial management, negotiations, migration, child and forced labor, labor relations, occupational safety and health, and social protection. He has a doctorate in management and a master's degree in adult education and business management. So that's Dr. Pascal Kaba. And then online is Madame Florence Eisi Kwote, who is the Director, Policy Planning and Monitoring and Evaluations of the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Protection of Ghana. She's a dedicated and accomplished professional with over 2 decades of experience in policy planning, monitoring, and child rights advocacy. So those are our 3 discussants. I would first like to start with Dr. Nimo Thompson. Thank you.
I can say, yeah, I'm all right. Thank you. Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. How long do I have to come? 10 minutes, all right, that's fine. A bit of a challenge given the various perspectives or angles involved in the 3 presentations, but we can come up with certain common themes and reflect on them, and they would apply equally. The first thing is the issue of conceptual clarity or conceptual commonality, if you will. So, for example, we take the issue of social spending for granted, but they may vary from country to country, as we saw in the case of Malawi versus the others. And even within countries, they may also have a wider spectrum. So beyond the traditional elements of education and health, and sometimes housing, as we saw there, in some contexts, things like public transportation, for example, is an integral part of social policy, in addition to things like subsidies, either for agriculture or certain critical staples or things that the public uses a lot. So in discussing the social, spending aspect of fiscal or economic policy, that's a spectrum that we want to pay attention to and will, of course, vary from country to country. There are, of course, indirect economic policies that have profound social implications also, that sometimes we don't explicitly incorporate into our analysis, but yet are there. What readily comes to mind is inflation, which, as we all know, disproportionately affect the poor, in the sense that besides decimating their purchasing power, the poor typically also do not have assets that appreciate with inflation. So they get battered on both sides. So keeping inflation down alone has an element of social protection that one can factor into a broader framework of transformative social policy. Now, in terms of debt and how it relates to social policy broadly and the transformative version, I think like the quotation from the late Ethiopian Prime Minister in terms of setting the political context and then using that as the basis for formulating economic policies. But there's also something that Kojo kept referring to, which is policy autonomy, which I have phrased somewhat differently. I call it a dual constituency problem faced by developing countries, where they win elections with the promise to do certain things for their constituents, and then they face crisis and they have to now pander to the demands of a second constituency outside. So they are constantly having to balance their policies between what they promised during elections and what their benefactors are demanding. And this has been ongoing for a while, and we've seen gradual incremental changes to the point where now almost every IMF program, if not all of them, kind of makes, it doesn't explicitly recognize the importance of social policy as a central part, but it more or less treats it as an appendix, something to placate CSOs who may say, well, IMF programs are damaging another, and then we say, well, at least there's a component there that deals with vulnerability and social exclusion and all that. And very often, they don't really go very far, but it is there. The question then is our capacity to engage them in such a way that we come out successful and minimize the likelihood of us returning to them in the first place. Georgie did mention that I previously worked as an advisor to the president. At the time, I was based at the presidency. And so I had the opportunity to be part of the team that negotiated the IMF program in 2015. That was my first direct engagement with the IMF, actually. And I was surprised by their limited analytical capacity, which we tend to take for granted. We see them and we think we've seen God. So any and everything they told us, we just accepted. And then I'll go and read some of them. I don't want to be too specific to embarrass them, but they were quite basic, and I'll raise them with one of the staff, and they protested and so forth. But the bottom line is that they are not always as accurate as we assume. But then on our side also, we often go into these things unprepared. Not just in these negotiations. I've been to international conferences and so forth and so on. The last one I remember clearly was us, about 2 or 3 Ghanaians sitting at a table like this, and about 12, 15 Americans on trade, on virtually every aspect of it. And sometimes these things also show up in our negotiations with the IMF. So the issue of analytical capacity from our own end to get the best outcomes from these engagements, be they economic or social outcomes, is also very critical. That means we need to constantly be doing research, and that is what the commission that I'm chairing now is actually going to be spending a lot of time doing. Another thing, and here I'd like to delve a bit more on some of my experience, are the contradictions that came up during these negotiations, where on the one hand, we were being berated publicly for having very high debt levels, but behind closed doors, the same donors were begging us to take in new loans before the IMF imposed a debt limit, which didn't make sense. Because outwardly, they said, listen, high debt is bad, but then behind closed doors, they were begging us to try and convince the Minister of Finance to take on new debt. So much so that during that period when we traveled to a certain European country, we actually had to hide in our hotel rooms because they were going around banging on doors trying to do this. It was after that that we learned how some of these debts are actually acquired. And that's, I put here pre-debt, what goes on, the quality of the debt. Some of the debt is actually supply driven. They have nothing to do with the priorities of the country that takes them on, but somebody comes along and says, listen, we have this amount of money, there's an element of grant there, and all we're looking for is grant. We hear free money without thinking about the quality of the debt itself, the pitfalls involved in that. And so we take them, only to find later on that we cannot service them. And that's a major challenge in terms of dealing with these issues. And so once you've locked yourself into these debts that are not aligned with development priorities, you get the money, you spend it on something that's not always productive, let's say infrastructure. But the infrastructure itself, my brother Kojo mentioned corruption. Sometimes it's heavily inflated. In the case of Ghana, we had the issue of $100 million inflated contract from a donor project. To the degree that the intrinsic value of the project cannot sustain such an inflated project, you will always have problems servicing your debt. And you must service your debt, whether it's at the expense of social spending or not. So once you go in there, you should be able to come up with the best debt structure that reflects your own capabilities, that reflects your own development priorities, as opposed to what others are trying to get you to take on. And then there's the issue of what happens once we've taken on the debt. How do we spend it? Someone mentioned, one of the presenters mentioned the fact that it goes into the budget. But what part of the budget does it go into? Is it consumption or is it for capital infrastructure spending? Again, here we talk about not just the provision of the infrastructure, but the utilization, the efficient utilization of the infrastructure. And this is very critical in the context of Africa in particular, because there have been studies. Generally, they talk about a positive relationship between infrastructure spending and economic growth. But in Africa, they've had studies that show a negative relationship between infrastructure and economic growth. And the lurking variables are often the poor quality of the infrastructure that we end up spending the money on. So there's a 3-lane highway that's constructed from a loan or whatever, with the assumption that it will reduce travel time, and that in turn will translate into efficient use of resources and so forth and so on, and therefore will contribute to economic growth. But what you see is that the 3-lane highway is ultimately, if you go to Kaneshi, has been reduced to 1-lane road. The other 2 lanes have been taken over by petty traders and so forth and so on. So you've restricted the capacity of that particular project to contribute to economic growth. And so when the time comes to pay your debt, you're going to struggle to do that, because the resource into which you plow that money is not yielding the necessary results. Sometimes it's also just waste. The late chairman, Professor Botre, who was our longest serving finance minister, he was the chairman when I was the director general. I used to have very insightful discussions with him, and he told me a story when he was finance minister where he saw a steady increase in his capital expenditure, and yet the public was complaining about bad roads and schools and so forth and so on. So he decided to investigate that, only to find that the bulk of the capital expenditure was actually going into buying 4-wheel drives for public officials. But on paper, it showed rising capital expenditure. So the quality of spending also has implications for it. This is not to excuse anyone or exculpate anyone in terms of making striking the right balance between economic decisions and social decisions. But there are consequences. If you take the loan anywhere, whether in Ghana or outside, you must pay. It's a principle of finance, whether be it international or not. But it's up to you, the borrower, to make the best of it. There may be circumstances beyond your control, but if you plan well, you should be able to manage them. Of course, the external teams themselves have their own interest. As I mentioned, the donors themselves have their interest. Commercial interests are also there, where they come and they try to force you to take on loans. Again, in 2015, during the IMF programs, it was foreign banks that tried to get us to take on loans as quickly as possible. I remember one of them came to see us at the presidency, and they had a long list of projects that they had identified. They had nothing to do with our own priorities. And some of the areas they even proposed already, they proposed to build district hospitals, and we already had district hospitals there. So imagine someone who didn't know, and then we sign on onto these things. And then lastly, there's the issue of, I think I wrote that here, the role of long-term planning. Yes, the role of long-term planning, which is often played down. And as Georgie said, we did, in fact, develop a long-term national development plan. The advantage of long-term planning, and everybody does that, is the fact that we don't hear other countries talking about their long-term national development plan doesn't mean that it exists. Not everything in there is fixed, but at least it gives you a sense of direction. In our case, it was 40 years, which was going to be split into 10 4-year plans that you will then keep adjusting to reflect your emerging circumstances. The time has come again for us to revisit that, for us to begin long-term planning. It helps not only in bringing you out of these IMF rabbit holes, but it helps to give you a resilience, let's say, a resilient economy that will always prevent you from going back to some of these crises that take you to the IMF constantly. So in the final analysis, the responsibility lies with us. We can blame others all we want. They're not going to change overnight, and it's not even clear that they will ever change. It is up to us to take the bull by the horns and structure policies in such a way that we always come up on top while navigating a very turbulent world, especially a world made even more turbulent now by what is going on in the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Dr. Kappa.
Good. So thank you very much. So as a unionist, I'll approach this from the union lens. And we as unions, we are always looking at employment, and we are also looking at how these things affect us in terms of employment, as well as how it affects our livelihoods as well, because employment is linked to livelihood. And so I'll look at it within three dimensions. I'll look at what is the problem, how this problem affects we within the labor front, and then the way forward. So within our scope, we see this issue to basically emerge out of overtaxation within our system. We see this problem to emerge from overtaxation within our system. We see that if you observe over the years, we have always kicked against any government going for any IMF program because of the conditionalities that come with the IMF programs. And so these conditionalities prevent us from the various social interventions that will come our way. Because based on these conditionalities, a lot of social interventions that are supposed to come our way, we are denied of these social interventions. And so these IMF programs actually are the cause of some of these problems that we are facing. Now, again, once the debt situations keep rising, what's the outcome? It basically means that there will be social unrest. Once the debt situations keep on rising, basically there will be social unrest because people will not have a livelihood, and once they don't have a livelihood, they have to make noise about the fact that they have no livelihood. And so based on that, there will be social unrest. Again, issues of unemployment basically is going to rise. Once debt rises, because governments will have to cut down on employing people because they don't have the money to take care of the people. And so they have to cut down. And so at the end of the day, we won't have a lot of people employed, so unemployment will rise. Once unemployment rises, then it means that vulnerable groups will be affected more. And the vulnerable groups, these are people within the low-income brackets, as well as women and children. These people will be affected more. How do these issues affect us within our value chain? I'll link it to the sector where I represent, which is the agriculture sector. What this basically means is that once the conditionalities are kept before us, issues of subsidies will be taken away. And so once we don't have subsidies, what it means is that in terms of production, production will drop. Because if you take, for instance, even if you look at Ghana, if you look at before we went into the, we went for the domestic the haircut. Before we went for the haircut, subsidies in terms of agriculture was far higher, but after that, it came out by almost half. And so what it simply means is that at the end of the day, our import bill will increase, and then what we end up producing in terms of we ourselves will go down. Again, there will be casualization of labor. And once there's casualization of labor, households will be more affected,
I'll look at it in terms of what is the way forward. We think that on issues of, we should look at how we invest within areas where we have comparative advantage. And one of the key areas we as Africans have a comparative advantage is agriculture. And so we should look at how we invest in areas how we have comparative advantage. Again, we should protect social spending flows. Again, we should look at issues of progressive taxes. We should clear issues of clear timetable for food import substitution. And above, we should look at, we form a Ghana debt and social policy compact working group. Form a Ghana debt social policy and compact working group where smallholder farmers, CSOs, we can draft a position paper on to be presented for the mid-year budget to look at some of these things. A concrete social policy buffer that can be deployed now. For instance, when you look at the issue of the school feeding program, when you look at the issue of the school feeding program, for instance, if we're able to restore it back to the 2 cities, 50 pesos per meal, and even extend it to the GSS, it will go a long way to improve the issue of. And then one key thing within this particular government, which is the Agriculture for Economic Transformation, Agriculture for Economic Transformation program, that should tell you that for us to be able to become debt sustaining and for us to have some kind of development within our country, it means we should concentrate more on issues of agriculture. And so if you look at currently, Ghana imports over 2.6 billion, which is equivalent to our 2-year IMF disbursement. And so if we are able to generate this within ourselves, we're able to produce this within the country, what it means is that we will not need 2 years of IMF's money. If Ghana is able to produce this for ourselves, we don't need 2 years of IMF's money. Again, if you look at, we do purpose fast-tracking solar-powered irrigation programs. Currently, our import bill for rice and maize within 5 years is around $520 million US, equivalent to the 2024 interest payment we paid on the Eurobonds alone. So if we're able to do a purpose fast-tracking solar-powered irrigation system, we focus on cereals, which is say maize and legumes, basically legumes. What it means is that we will be able to fix 20% of our import bill on issues of rice and maize. We should also look at rethinking the fiscal space, where we reallocate 1% of our GDP from energy tax waivers granted to mining and telecommunications to restore capital grounds on issues of school feeding, on the issues of school feeding. Another key factor is for us to swap debt with some of the SDGs that we intend to achieve, especially on the issue of food security. For instance, if we're able to freeze some of our debt repayments, that money can be kept into issues of, let's say, providing community-based interventions. And then solidarity, wealth, and windfall taxes. Solidarity, wealth, and windfall taxes. An example is in Colombia and Spain, where they were able to raise 0 to 1% of GDP earmarked for poverty alleviation related programs. Last but not the least, I think that we can also recenter the use of borrowed money, not just through the stocks, but introduce an SDG-aligned use of proceeds disclosure requirement for syndicated loans and Eurobonds. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those really concrete proposals. I think chair of the NDPC is listening. Yeah. Okay. So is Mrs. Florence Sikwote online? Is still online? Madam, would like to hear from you.
I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Good evening, everybody, and thanks very much to the GETSPA project and ideas and the Institute of African Studies, the University of Ghana, for giving us the opportunity to be part of this webinar, and also to express our appreciation for getting the ministry involved to share some ideas that we have in the management of debt crisis and in social protection policy. I will come from the side of sectors responsible for social protection and the role they can play in such situations. For example, Ghana, we are working on the post-COVID recovery program under the IMF, and the experience we have as a ministry to share is how we're able to leverage on the program to get some key policies for social protection and the protection of the vulnerable passed as part of some of the conditionalities. Because if you have the opportunity as a sector to be involved in the negotiations, you will see how sometimes the neglected aspect of social protection can be pushed for you to be able to use this opportunity to protect the vulnerable during the management of debt crisis. And the Ministry of Gender, National and Social Protection, which is responsible for the protection of the vulnerable, that manages the livelihood empowerment against poverty program and the Ghana School Feeding Program, have been working with the Ministry of Finance to use this opportunity to get our National Social Protection Bill passed to cement the gains that we have made in the areas of social protection. So the passage of the Social Protection Bill is part of the conditionalities for the post-COVID program of growth that we are running as a country now. And we also push for the protection of the grant amounts for late beneficiaries. That's because we know that debt crisis come with high inflation and loss of livelihood for the poor, and also the shrinking value of the grant has been a worrying source for a long time. So what we also did in line with the post-COVID program is also to negotiate for a protection of the grant amount. That's an indexation mechanism was developed with the Ministry of Finance to ensure that we will protect the value of the grant from being eroded as a result of inflation. So as we speak, we have a mechanism in place to guard against the devaluing of the value of the LEAP grant to beneficiaries. With regards to issues of social protection, we've also ensured that there's some space in the grant to support the payment, space in the program to support payment of LEAP grant and the Ghana School Feeding Program as part of the interventions that government is supporting. This has to ensure that the grants are being paid on time and also ensuring that caterers also get their pay on time and not delayed as it was. But one thing that we know that we need to advocate for in these areas is the issue of persons with disability, especially because not all of them fall within the extreme poverty line, and as such, they may struggle to find themselves within the extreme poor program that they are having. And the kind of lifeline support that we can make available to them must be clearly spelled out in these conditions. And I do agree with the previous speaker that we need to be ready when you go for these negotiations. Because if you're not ready, you will not know how to direct the investment that is coming into the country, especially towards assisting the poor. Otherwise, it will go into projects that really don't add value to the country's economy. And it's something that we have witnessed as a ministry that we are trying to guard against. So we're looking at how the funds will go directly to beneficiaries to improve their livelihood and to make sure that they have some form of support to be able to be resilient. We're also looking at how we can improve the targeting system for the various social protection interventions in the country. So in this regard, we also ensure that there's funding available for us to complete our national household registry. That is the single targeting system for social protection in the country to ensure that the data set is complete. And as we speak now, we are 98% complete of getting all the poor and extreme poor people details onto the program to serve as a unified source of targeting social protection interventions. So that is what we are also doing as a ministry in this area. Yes, we had wished to get more funding for the Ghana School Feeding Program. Sarah was talking about us moving from 1 cedi, 2 cedis, 20 pesos to 2 cedis, 50 pesos. Really, our proposal was for 3 cedis, 50 pesos, but we're told that the fiscal space is not available for us, so the feeding grant was remain at 2 cedis for now, and we are hoping that we'll be able to increase the amount in the next fiscal year. And then so are also other policies that we are doing to assist the protection of the vulnerable, the revision of the early childhood care and development policies, the amendment of the Domestic Violence Act, passage of the Affirmative Action Act, and its ally that we are working on this year. All this are supposed to make sure that by the time the program is over, the social protection sector is resilient to support whatever group that was spare on after the project. But what we also want to highlight that this is a critical thing. This is an example that we give that as a best practice that other countries can adopt. That when such programs are in, the sector responsible for social protection shouldn't step back and say it is the responsibility only of the Ministry of Finance, but have the papers and the concept notes available to them to negotiate for some aspect of social protection within the program. And also ensure that the programs that are being added will have real benefit to the beneficiaries and the system effective, not just looking at project-based alone, but to affect the whole system. And then also the issue of inclusive dialogues with other social protection interventions, strengthening the communication between, like for example, now we meet every quarter to discuss disbursement of the capitation grant, the National Health Insurance, the LEAP, the school feeding, the Ministry of Finance, together with the Controller and Accountant General and other partners to see how the whole system is moving towards helping the vulnerable. And it's really have engendered us to other key stakeholders. Hitherto will have seen us as the people at the bottom. But now when they are discussing all the issues, energy, electricity, they are discussing taxes and everything, the social protection sector is there to also make sure that their inputs are heard. So for us, we'll say that we are committed that in the recovery programs we are happening in the country, we'll still prioritize the well-being of the vulnerable, and we remain strong and open to discussions that will better help us position the interests of the vulnerable. And this is what we have to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Kwote, for these insights into some of the practices of the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection. So, if you have any questions now to ask any of these presenters.
Thank you so much to our distinguished panel. My name is George. I'm from Zimbabwe, and I've learned a lot of practical things from yourselves as actors. So I'll also go for a practical question. So my question, sort of an inquiry, is to my colleague from the labor movement. I'm happy that colleagues from Ghana have shown us that debt in Ghana is rising. So my question to you is, what is your position as a union to this rising debt? And what have you done, or what can you do when you see the debt rising as a labor movement? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Cleopas, and I'm from Zambia. My question, I think, will exclude the labor union because I consider them a pressure group like myself. But I'll then speak to government. I think your presentation, director, was very insightful in telling us what goes on behind the closed door, which I think sometimes academics do not know. But then I want to ask, in this conversation, including with our colleague from the ministry, we seem to start from a position where we have already accepted that the solution is programs like the social cash transfer and school feeding, and then tinkering with these to add on that and that. But if we go back to our golden years, we had developmentalism, which was more expansive social services. So haven't we already lost if where we are starting from is thinking this is the solution, and then how else can we expand it? Thank you.
Person online.
Yes,
Thank you to the distinguished speakers for the presentations. My question also goes to the director from the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection. Listening to you, if I wasn't seeing you, I would have sworn it's the story of Kenya, yeah, and any other country. And I think the thing is, because the World Bank and the IMF and the YMF, those are the exact words and those are the exact conditionalities that have been put on Kenya in terms of a loan agreement. And the script is the same all across, you know, the emphasis on cash transfers, the emphasis on passing sometimes very flawed bills, like the social protection bill in Kenya is quite flawed. If you read it, it actually narrows down even social protection just to safety nets, you know. And I don't see, I mean, you know, the issue of efficient targeting, you know, efficient targeting. the wording is so similar, the script is the same, it's just a copy-paste that's is being passed around across the continent, like Africa. Yeah, Africa is a country, but Africa is not a country. And I think it calls for much more scrutiny for government, I think, at higher levels, especially planning, yeah? Because sometimes we get into this, these conditionalities are accepted, but actually what happens is they end up hurting long-term planning and development planning in the long run. And so I think for me, Madam Director, I think looking at it, it feels like it's just the same script that has been passed all across the continent, that the IMF now have found an opportunity to push forth things that maybe could have been lagging. Thank you.
Any others? Yes, please. Ayob, and then I don't know your name. Maybe you start and then you come to Ayob.
My name is Benjamin, a student from the University of Ghana. My question is to the presenter from the union. I believe this seminar is for transformative social policy in Africa, and you touch on comparative advantage in terms of agriculture for Africa. And it's clear for many years that comparative advantage seems to be an illusion for Africa. So my question is, do you agree comparative advantage for Africa is still the way forward, or Africa should rethink that illusion that has been imposed on us? Thank you.
Okay, my question is for the presenter from the national, from the Planning Commission, and also linking with some of the arguments my colleague Emmanuel was making about, and you endorsed it, about the importance of long-term planning for such kind of transformative social policy making. And I want to refer to a particular, I don't know, book chapter or journal article that I read, written by colleagues from Manchester, where they compare Uganda and Ghana in terms of how they negotiated the reality that they get from the oil extracted from their territories. And the kind of argument that they make is, for instance, in Uganda, when the oil was discovered and, I don't know, Shell or Total came to the government saying that let's explore it and this is the kind of negotiation that we can enter into, then Museveni asked the question, how many petroleum engineers do we have in this country? How many petroleum engineers? And, you know, about the capacity of, asking the capacity of the country to handle those issues. And it was almost non-existent. Then that means they stop the negotiation and move forward towards building that capacity they need so that they negotiate with them in a good standing. Whereas in Ghana, once the oil was discovered, extracting it and producing and selling it into the international market was kind of considered by the then government as one way of, you know, showing that they are good in terms of their management. And because of the electoral pressure of winning, Ghana ended up having less royalty from the oil extract compared to Uganda. This is where the long-term planning is relevant, and also the challenge of electoral democracy, liberal democracy, the way it has been established and institutionalized across our countries is never compatible with the kind of development planning and envisioning that we need to have. And I think this particular case will definitely show us the capacity that we need, the long-term planning and vision that we need to have as a country, if it doesn't fit with the political process, which is very much cyclical, very competitive, very short-sighted, then I think that's a conundrum that we should definitely deal with. So I wonder if you have any reflection on this. Thank you.
So one last question online, and then we will come back to our panel. So somebody, Agoho Akpome, wanted to ask a question.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the colleagues for the excellent presentations. I'm speaking from South Africa. I work at the University of Zululand. I'm a Nigerian by birth. I want to thank Dr. Thompson in particular. I do not think I have heard anybody from government speak as frankly as he has spoken today, especially in regard to the kinds of negotiations and the contexts in which some of these debt deals are reached between an African country such as Ghana and the Bretton Woods institutions. I'm particularly impressed by two. He said several things, but I'll just mention two because I don't have time. When he said that often the analysis presented by these institutions, these funding institutions, the pronouncements are not as accurate. And then he made the admission that sometimes we take any and everything they say to us in terms of the truth assumptions, the analysis. I would extend that to mean even the very theories upon which our ideas of development, our practice and ideas of development are based. And then he says we need to improve our analytical capacity in order to enter into those engagements in ways that would give us more chances of success. I find that very, very deep. It's a view that I share. And when he also said some of these loans are supply side driven, I don't want to speculate, but it tends to reinforce the impression that I have that when we speak of corruption on the side of African governments in collecting and managing loan, there's sufficient room to speculate that that corruption is also on the other side. If somebody is going to chase you to your hotel rooms to ask you to borrow money, let's leave to the imagination what more things he can do to make you, borrow that amount of money. I think that's something we need to consider, especially in the public domain and as researchers when you discuss these things. So I'm going to ask Dr. Thompson one question, please. Mr. Kaba has made a very radical suggestion.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm doing that now, sorry. He made a very radical submission, which of course will normally come from a trade unionist. But hearing what we have heard, what the colleagues from Kenya, the colleagues from Ethiopia are saying, these are very structural problems. What will it take from the point of view of people in government, Dr. Thompson, to make radical actions, such as freezing debt repayments? Because we are in a cycle, and the way we are going about it, as the first person who asked the question, one of the first questioners says, it doesn't seem as if touching panel beating policies here and there will get African countries out of this situation. Let me stop there. But thank you very much, and thanks to all the presenters as well.
Thank you, Mr. Akpome, from all the way from South Africa. So let's reverse the order. I'd like to start with Ms. Kwote first, and then to be followed by Dr. Kaba, and then Dr. Thompson will be the last respondent. Please, let's be brief. We've run out of time, but I really wanted us to have this exercise of questions and answers as well. So thank you. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me start from what I put down, whether we've not already lost, because we seem to be looking at some kind of programs here and there as the solutions that we need to deal with. I think we need to also look at our situation as countries and be realistic with what we have. There are situations that need solutions now, while we do also plan for the long term. And the long-term planning, I'm glad that Dr. Thompson is here. They are giving us a blueprint for the long-term planning, and it includes also ensuring that children now are able to survive and thrive and be productive in future. And therefore, access to education, ensuring that they have good nutrition, ensuring that the vulnerable or the extreme poor within the country have access to some form of social protection, whether it be cash grant, whether it be in a form of productive inclusion or skills that people need to have, is critical now, and then seeing what else we will do at the long term. And for practices in social protection, it is a science. And I'm not holding a brief for any World Bank program, but as a community of social protection, there are key things you need to put in place to build your floor, to ensure that you have concrete definitions and things like that. And that's how come we need to have these laws and these policies to guide our program. That's not to say that as a country, you do not look at what your intentions are for the future. And there are, yes, the World Bank will try to push you here, the IMF will try to push you, but you need to know what you want for your country, what the long-term plan is, and how that policy you are developing situates within the long term. So if you're able to do that, then you're able to build a policy that will reflect the aspiration of the country in the long term, and at the same time, looking at what can be achieved within the medium term to look at the critical issues facing the country. Because in the medium term, in the debt crisis, there are things that are affecting people on the borderline of poverty that need critical attention. And those things must be solved now and then. And also looking at, when you talk about the long-term planning lost, or how it seems to be like the same book that is being sold out. I'm sure we go to school, we read textbooks, but how you apply that textbook to your life and the things you're doing, that makes a difference between somebody who's reading theory and somebody who's reading practice. But one thing that I always also want to emphasize is the need for capacity of public servants and people who negotiate on behalf of government. Because there are so many things that I have rejected for our country in this plan that we have. There are things they are proposed, there are things that you kick out of the table because we said no, it will not be done, we will not do it. So it's up to you to go with a strong point. But of course, it's good that we structure ourselves and know how as a country. And sometimes it becomes political because, as you said, the system is every 4 years. And retaining power is also critical to the politicians. And also sometimes the complaint from the general public also scare the politicians. So we need to be strong, and we all need to let the citizen know of the truth. What can be done and what cannot be done. What is too expensive to do at each time, and how we'll be able to streamline our expenditure in line with what we have, and for the citizen to understand. And when we say we are streamlining, everybody must be seen as streamlining for the whole country to benefit, but not one aspect asked to tighten their belt and another aspect of the economy seen as expanding their belt to absorb everything that is being produced. And then, of course, one thing that I've realized that sometimes we don't do well is explaining to the citizenry the real situation. Sometimes we want to hide how deep we are in debt, and for them not to get, so they get speculated figures and they can't understand where we are and what the situation is. How do we explain this in a simple term for the average Ghanaian to understand that we are in crisis, and the fact that some things will be cut and these are the effects that will come? And how do we structure our system and our expectation to meet all those things in the time of crisis? And then, of course, there's a question that somebody asked about the realities of being leaders in agriculture, or having an influence in production and things like that. I think over the years, our focus has been produce for export, and we are not looking at producing to feed the nation itself based on what we need. We see the introduction of crops and other things that normally are not staples in the local economy that is being championed in the interest of getting foreign exchange. And we are looking at a population that is not getting enough food because this is the focus that we are doing. We need to look at how the whole economic of the country will be structured to focus on building resilience internally before we look at exporting and looking at how we even trade among ourselves as countries to raise more resources in Africa than looking at external than Europe and things like that, where the system is built against that. So I'll end here and then hand over to my other discussant to add more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam. Doctor.
Okay, thank you very much.
Briefly.
I will take it from is agriculture still where we have our comparative advantage? Yes, I will say yes. It's where we still have our comparative advantage. The only issue has to do with the fact that we within Africa are refusing to prioritize it the way it should be prioritized. But if you look at current trends within Africa, you see that most of the governments are trying to go back into prioritizing agriculture. If you take, for instance, even when the Malawian was presenting the issues of farm inputs and all those things, should tell you that it's because that is where they can have economic recovery. That's why those things are being introduced. If you look at Ghana's situation, where we are now talking about agriculture for economic transformation, it means that we are seeing agriculture to be where we can break through. That is why we are saying that for there to be economic transformation, then it must be agriculture. And so still, agriculture is still where we have our comparative advantage. But we still need to push more in terms of getting our governments to prioritize this sector and stop giving it much of the lip service. That's the issue. If you take, for instance, I was talking about when subsidies were cut somewhere in 2020 in Ghana, for instance, our maize yield dropped by about 12% because our subsidies were cut. Then to the person who talked about whether we, the unions, still see debt levels rise. Of course, we see debt level rising. In Ghana, for instance, post domestic debt exchange, we went to 88% of GDP, being the levels to which our debts were rising. What can we do? As pressure movement groups, basically, what we need to do is to get more information within what is causing the problem. So we should do more evidence-based research, so that when we are talking to the issues, we know what to tell the government, we know what to tell to the duty bearers. Again, what should we do? We should look at holding governments more accountable for the various loans they decide to go for. And we should also look at how we advocate for there to be transparency within the debt management portfolios. And so basically we are within the union movement. What we can do within this spectrum is to get more information about the situation, and once we get more information about the situation, then we can then advocate on the situation and look at how we get things to be more transparent for economic transformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Thompson, you have a hard task, but we don't have time.
Okay, no problem.
Yes.
So just as a quick observation, that so far the discussion has revolved around social policy in normal times and social policy in times of crisis, specifically debt crisis, and how we are handling that. So I want us to bear that in mind. Now, let me start with the last one, then I'll work my way back up with the question from South Africa as to whether or not we can reduce or ask for radical action, whether or not we can refuse to pay our debt servicing or to make our debt service payments. And I think one of the speakers, was it Charles, who mentioned Yintua? For those of you who are not Ghanaians, Yintua means we wouldn't pay. And we've been there before. This was in 1972, 73, when the government rejected, I think that the technical term is odious debt. And so he said Yintua. So it worked for a while, but eventually we had to do that. But the responsibility ultimately lies on us. We went and borrowed. And if something goes wrong and you cannot pay for it, we need to look at the drivers. As I said, some of it is supplier driven. So it's up to you. If you allow someone to come and dangle money, I'll give you an example where these people who give out the loans, they may start the year, let's say, go and get us $2 billion. Africans to borrow $2 billion from us. That's the mandate to their, what do you call these people who go around for insurance? Salespeople. Yeah, so go to Africa and they will look for 10 African countries, dangle something in front of them, $200 million US. They weren't even thinking about $200 million, but that's their objective. So we sign here and there, and then you are onto it. So it's your responsibility. You need to be vigilant. But one question I want us to consider is also why debt stroke aid, because some aid is also debt, subsidized loans. Why debt has worked for some countries, but it has failed for others. Given all factors, colonialism, so forth and so on, why has it worked for others and not some, but not others? And what really readily comes to mind, for instance, is Japan. Japan, after the war, borrowed the equivalent of about $10 billion in today's prices, and it invested in about 34, 38 different projects that served as the basis for its economic transformation. And of course, it emerged as an economic power. By the 1980s, it was so powerful that the United States was even threatened by it. And the United States then made deliberate efforts to more or less hold Japan down. So about $10 billion US. We borrowed about $11 billion US, slightly more than that, not about, slightly more than that, in 4 years. And we have nothing to show for it. Right after that, we actually went into debt default. And the infrastructure that we said we were going to spend on it didn't really materialize. So we need to consider those questions. Is it a question of governance? When we are going there to borrow the money, what kind of analysis do we do before we go out there? In the case of Ghana, we tend to use generalities. We are going to borrow for liability management, and nobody actually questions the basis of that. When you bring out the money, what project are you going to invest in? How much are you going to invest in? What is going to be the rate of return, and how are you going to finance that? None of those questions are asked, except that we go and we are happy. Those of you who follow the news, we are always boasting, well, it was oversubscribed, and that then becomes the basis of celebration, when oversubscription really means nothing. Ultimately, it's your ability to utilize the loans the way the Japanese did that matters. And speaking of Japan, again, personally, I like to make a distinction between debt levels as a GDP and your debt servicing as a share of your revenue. Now, Japan, as we all know, has the largest or the highest debt GDP ratio in the world, over 200%. I think it's 235%. Very high. We have come down a little bit from the 88 that he mentioned, but Japan still gives us aid. So what is missing there? What is missing is simply the debt servicing burden. Japan spends about 9% of its revenue on debt service, and while at one point we're actually spending 45% of our revenue on that. If you throw in the wage bill, then we have virtually nothing left for that. So the issue of debt burden and its management and its servicing is more nuanced than the popular appeal for debt GDP ratio. Currently, our target is 45. Trust me, we can reduce it to 30 and still find it difficult servicing because of those dynamics that we don't pay attention to. So yes, we can get on the rooftops and refuse to pay, but there are consequences. I believe that we should take responsibility and do these things. The brother from Ethiopia talked about vision. I couldn't agree with you more. I'm actually happy to say that I was happy when you put Melis's picture there, because I was actually a consultant to his office, I believe in 2006. I didn't get to meet him, he was busy, but I met his economic advisor then, and I reviewed a lot of Ethiopian government documents. Later on, he was a very progressive leader, by the way. used to invite African intellectuals. I think he invited you, Charles, and a few other people to go and meet with him, so forth. So it was a good experience for me. But yes, for long-term plans, we need a vision. And that vision then needs to be operationalized in medium-term plans where you make adjustments. The example I always give of the United States, which is why everyone is going there, is that they actually have a 100-year plan for creating jobs that most Americans and certainly most people outside of America don't know about. But it's 100 years, 1950 to 2050, which is split into 10-year installments. And that brings together academia, industry, and government for them to plan on. So if you Google Occupational Outlook Handbook, you will see that there. That's one of the advantages of long-term planning that gives you the vision to go with that. Kenya, I wrote down what you said. The script is the same. And then I put that in quotes and I said, but the actors are different. That's precisely because the people who go around are the same individuals. He will come here to Ghana and consult. He goes back to Washington, spend a couple of weeks, and then he's on the plane to Kenya and all that. And you can only do so much as an individual. That's why it is incumbent upon us to understand our economy in its most comprehensive form. But we don't, because we live it. As an economist, I usually go beyond what the textbooks tell me and experience it. We call it experiential analysis. So in the case of Ghana, I don't know the situation in Kenya and all those places. We constantly talk about private sector development, supporting SMEs and so forth and so on. But none of those, in the last budget I reviewed just last night, actually, the last loan, was $200 million US. Along the line, they're going to give $5,000 to people and so forth and so on. But nowhere does it mention one obstacle to enterprise development in Ghana that as a Ghanaian I know, which is that they have to pay 4 years in advance for rent. I don't know whether it happens in Kenya and so, but it is a major obstacle to entrepreneurship development in Ghana. So you pay 4 years, you also have to pay 2 years for rental accommodation. So in the end, you are left with nothing, and that's what explains all these things over there. So ultimately, we have to have the authority on our economy so that when they come, we can question. There's a time when I saw a document that was meant for Ghana, but they forgot to, you use the term cut and paste, right? They forgot to remove Sierra Leone from it. So it was meant for Ghana, but it has Sierra Leone there. I think it had Leones or something like that. So ultimately, I personally like that ultimately we need to take responsibility for these things. But the nature of the world is such that we have to engage them and the interest involved. I remember not too long ago, Ghana went on the financial market, international markets to get Eurobonds. I forget the amount involved, but a few weeks later, Egypt also went and raised money the same way. But if you read the news stories, you get the feeling that someone sat somewhere and wrote what seemed to be separate news releases for separate countries. But actually, it was the same people. But then they need their money. And then if you fall for it, it's up to you. And then lastly, brother in T-shirt, what was your question? Or you forgotten it? If you forgotten it, then it saves me time. Okay.
Your question was the trade union.
No, he had one for me also. Yeah, I think I put it down. But let me just wrap it up, even if you don't. From a development.
You can continue outside anyway.
No problem. But let me just wrap it up.
Yeah.
For our own benefit. One, development is history, so it's always critical that we look at what has gone before us. It also goes beyond politics. I also believe that it's an exercise in mental liberation for us. For instance, if someone talked about Uganda, why is it that it's always others who come to discover oil for us? When we are sitting on the damn thing and we can discover it, what is it? And we graduate in all these engineers and so forth and so on. So we need to begin that process of questioning ourselves and then situating it in the context of history. In Ghana, it goes back hundreds of years. When we started, 2 people from Cape Coast started Ashanti Goldfields. And then at some point they said, well, they didn't have the capital, so they were going to raise it. So they sold Ashanti Goldfields to a British man called Cade. And since then, we've been selling everything we have to a British man or someone because we said we couldn't. So that mental liberation prerequisite is so critical. And that can only come about when we understand our history as to how we got here. That's one reason why when people ask me, what is your favorite EPL team, I get angry. I don't support any European teams because we've run down all of our leagues and then we turn other people's leagues into secular religion. mental slavery. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think it's my pleasant duty to bring this event to an end. I want to say a few thank yous before we go. I first of all want to thank the GETSPA research team, all the 8 research teams for the amount of work they've brought to the table, and to especially thank our 3 representatives, Ethiopia, Malawi, and Ghana, for helping us to engage with Ghanaian policymakers. I am really grateful to the policymakers and the trade unionists that we brought to the table. It's not often that you can find very high caliber policymakers who take time off to come and talk to researchers. If we did more of that in Africa, I believe that we would really make progress with policy transformation. So I'm really grateful that they came. Madam Kwote from the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection, Dr. Nimoy Thompson, the chair of the NDPC, thank you so much for coming, and Dr. Kaba from the trade union movement, thank you so much. I really believe that this is a kind of conversation that we need to have in order to chart a way forward for our continent. I was a bit surprised by the level of consensus and unanimity about some of the issues about the way forward. When I think of what we've been saying over the past 2 days and listening to these policymakers, and so I hope that this is just the beginning. This is a research project. We promised ourselves that we'd be engaged in a bit of advocacy, quite a bit of advocacy. So we will come back to you with our findings and engage you about how to move forward with some of our findings. So thank you very much. There's refreshments outside. I'm sure we are all thirsty, so let's have a drink and then continue this conversation. And last but not least, to our colleagues online, thank you so much for coming and staying the course. And we apologize for starting late. It's harder for those who are online when that happens. So thank you and good night. Bye-bye. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.